Well, when I think of Freud's effect on society around the world, especially in Europe and America, the first thing I think of are the lines from W.H. Auden's poem about Freud, in which he said, he is not a person now, but a whole climate of opinion. And Freud, even in his own lifetime, had become a climate of opinion. And his ideas had been disseminated, distorted, causing social changes, anxieties, counterattacks, misinterpretations, and a very large following well before he died. But the second thing I think is that he died in 1939, very soon after the invasion of Poland. And psychoanalysis continued. So when we think about Freud, we're thinking, well, when I think about Freud, the first thing that comes to mind is a poem that W.H. Auden wrote over half a century ago, in which he said, Freud is no longer a person, but a whole climate of opinion. That is to say, by the middle of the 20th century, Freud and psychoanalytic thinking had permeated virtually every field of inquiry and artistic activity in the West. And by today, we can say that, like Shakespeare, he is a global phenomenon and continues both in his own writing, but in the course of psychoanalysis more generally, to have profound effects on cultures everywhere. And the second thing I think is that Freud did die in 1939, and shortly after the invasion of Poland. He didn't live to see the consequences of the war and the Holocaust, but he would not have been surprised at the savage brutality and profound anti-Semitism, since he had lived with that and thought about it for virtually his whole life. Nevertheless, he died in 1939, and psychoanalysis has developed in many, many different ways since then. It was never a simple matter of Freudian doctrine or writings. Psychoanalysis was controversial from the beginning, within the psychoanalytic movement, as well as well beyond it. So when we think about Freud, we're thinking about very complex developments that are part of the evolution of modernism and now postmodernism in various ways and in various different cultural contexts. So you can't equate psychoanalysis with Freud by any means. If you were to look at the contemporary journals in psychoanalysis, there would be much more of other things than Freud. Much is anchored in Freud and basic ideas that he introduced in the late 19th and early 20th century, but much goes well beyond what he thought and his particular perspective on the questions that he raised. So we're talking about something inevitably quite complex and varied, and I think that's the way it should be. Anyone who provoked as much new thinking about who we are as human beings would inevitably lead to that kind of complex response. So today, you can find Freud wherever you look, either directly or indirectly. He will turn up as a character in a film. Most Dangerous Method, a film that is about 2 years old, has Freud and Jung as characters. It's based on actual historical events and a key relationship to a young woman that they each had. And in some ways it's quite accurate. In other ways it's quite melodramatic. So Freud will return as a historical figure in a film in his own person, or he might turn up in a play like Freud's Last Session, a play that's been playing for several years now and is quite good, and I think captures very important aspects of Freud's personality. And so Freud is around in that sense, but you will also find Freudian characters wherever you look. In comedy, Billy Crystal will play an analyst in a very funny way and analyze this. Or you might find Freud behind the interpretation of a new production of King Lear, which I just saw, broadcast around the world, by the way, from London, in which the family relationships in that play are portrayed in a way that would have been hard to conceive without the history of psychoanalysis contributing to the understanding of character, as well as contemporary attitudes toward old age. The actor who played Lear actually said that he found signs of dementia and was interested in the medical literature as well as the psychology of the character. This would not have surprised Freud. He always thought that personality is a confluence of social, cultural, personal, and biological influences. Although he didn't have the biology that we have now that can show some of the very deep genetic and temperamental features of personality. He didn't know about hormones, for example, but he did know a lot about adolescence. So Freud is pervasive in the sense that psychoanalysis is pervasive. But Freud himself, for the last 40, 50 years, has often been quite seriously caricatured. There's still a dominant image of Freud in American culture is that stern-looking character holding a cigar. The father scrutinizing your behavior and seeing your secrets. Or worse, the Hannibal Lecter, the psychiatrist who's also a madman. These things keep turning up, and very negative portrayals of psychiatrists who are not distinguished from psychoanalysts turn up in the media in various ways. But psychoanalysis has moved well beyond Freud in those respects. Freud's vision was also quite limited, partly because he was born toward the middle of the 19th century and still had a lot of 19th century positivistic and hydraulic thinking, as if the mind were a closed system that moved its libido from one avenue to another. People no longer think that way. He also was limited to a focus on what he called the Oedipal level of development, triangular relationships within the family, father, mother, child, and the rivalries and desires that go with that. Today, the focus would be on much earlier developmental features of infancy. And an enormous amount of research that was not available to Freud about infancy, about early relationships, about the profoundly formative effects of the earliest relationships and interactions with the world. These were not available to Freud, even though he opened the way to this kind of understanding. So today, that would be more the focus than an immediate interest in triangular relationships within the family, the authority of the father, the movement from symbiotic enmeshment with the mother. Although these ideas are still there, they're in a much broader context than they were and have been considerably deepened by our understanding of the first year or two of life. A good deal of that research took place not only in Europe but in Boston. And It's very fascinating research. And it's done by psychologists as well as psychoanalysts. The boundaries are not that strictly adhered to all the time. But it has mainly enriched the theory and practice of psychoanalysis. And this is something that has not always affected American psychology, which is more experimental and statistical, whereas psychoanalysis, by necessity, deals primarily with individuals, with their histories, with their lives, with their dreams, with their fantasies, and the effect on the arts derives from that focus of psychoanalysis. Well, sometimes you can say that very directly. For example, a novel several decades ago that was quite a sensation, D.M. Thomas's novel, The White Hotel, that takes psychoanalysis directly and Freud and his followers directly as material for a book that explores the history of a woman's life and neurosis, beginning with a very crazy fantasy dream, very erotic, and follows her through a very fascinating life in the 20th century that ends at Baba Yar. It's a fascinating novel, and it's directly involved with and affected by an understanding of psychoanalysis and historical material that comes from the history of psychoanalysis. And you can also find other writers who responded directly to Freud, like D.H. Lawrence, who wrote 2 books about the unconscious, in which he argued with Freud, and his own novels are, in a sense, arguments with Freud. And in many ways, he was a little ahead of Freud, because for Lawrence, the relation between the mother and the son is so central that he could see some dimensions of that relationship that psychoanalysis didn't get to until later on. In a strange way, psychoanalysis developed backwards historically. It started by looking at mainly a boy at the age of 4 or 5 and seeing the world through his experience, and then worked its way backwards to the earliest formations of human identity in the relationship between an infant and the mother and the world. Freud rarely went that far back, and when he did, he didn't feel comfortable. It's what he called the oceanic feeling, he talked about in relation to a writer, is something that felt alien to him. But later on in the history of psychoanalysis, that level of experience became much more central. And the questions that were raised by patients and in cultural contexts had a lot more to do with the formation of identity in the first place, as opposed to the rivalries that come when there's a great deal of differentiation among the actors. So Lawrence was ahead of his time, and one of the writers who directly encountered Freud, but it's hard to find a writer who was not affected by him, even if, like Nabokov, he rejected him outright. He didn't think Freud made any sense in relation to his own novels or creative process. I think there might have been some defensiveness in that position since he writes about things that are quite interesting from a psychoanalytic point of view. And you would find that the development of film in particular, as well as painting and sculpture and photography, all are affected by the idea that we are motivated by unconscious desires, fears, and anxieties. This is a fundamental idea that is now part of virtually universal thinking about human beings that owes its force and its exploration to Freud. He didn't invent the idea, but he made it central to the understanding of how human beings engage in dynamic and conflicted and unstable relationships as they strive to maintain their own identities within various cultural contexts. Freud opened that up in a way that was like Pandora's box. You can't close it again. It's part of us now. It will be part of human thinking as long as we're around. Freud didn't think about unconscious mental life in only one way. Freud thought that unconscious thinking and unconscious processes were happening all the time for everyone. Some of these unconscious processes were the result of conflicts and dynamic forces and tensions between conscious life and things that we don't want to see about ourselves or know about ourselves. So it's that dynamic unconscious that began to be part of creative thinking in general. I mean, think of a Hitchcock film. A Hitchcock film will reach for dreams. Salvador Dali actually wrote the dream sequences in early Hitchcock film, Spellbound. Surrealism wants to draw on the unconscious sources of creative expressions. So artists begin to see themselves as, in a sense, Freudian beings. And unconscious motivations become a wellspring of creative activities insofar as they can be managed, channeled, given form in various arts. So artists want to reach the unconscious. You couldn't have Jackson Pollock's paintings without unconscious activity. And just about every art form owes some of its thinking about itself to the notion of unconscious motivation and unconscious sources of inspiration and expression, or symbolism. Well, you could take a few easy examples. Take Hitchcock, whose films are kind of often detective stories seeking to expose the unconscious motivations of the central characters. Dreams, profound fantasies find their way into the medium because they think of dreaming as a kind of foundation of the creative activity itself. And this owes this owes an enormous amount to Freud. The interpretation of dreams continues to be an enormously rich source of inspiration for creative people. Because what Freud did that nobody had done before was to say the dream is replete with meaning. It's not a book about dreaming, it's a book about the interpretation of dreams. It's a book about how dreams can be shown to have meaning within the context of the dreamer's life. Not within the context of some divine dispensation or some allegorical code book, but within the individual life of the dreamer. And this then informs the idea of character or personality in virtually all the arts. I have, to take another not so obvious example, I had a wonderful friend named Jerome Liebling, a photographer. His photographs were just in a wonderful exhibit in New York. I saw his photographs all gathered together and began to notice that in every one of them there's a mix in the photograph itself of a kind of abstract design composed of lines and curves. And I could go on from there to try to understand how that made sense of aspects of his life even beyond photography. But I don't think he consciously looked for lines and curves to unify his photographs. I think he could do that without being conscious of it, because he had access in his photographic vision to those sources of inspiration. And I'm sure they had many meanings. Freud also said that all of these things are what he called overdetermined. That is to say, they have more than one meaning. They're not reducible to simply one meaning. to give you another clinical example that you could find counterparts to in the theater, recently a wonderful psychoanalyst philosopher named Jonathan Lear gave a short account of a man he saw in psychoanalysis for several years. And he noticed early on that this man would leave the door open a little bit and leave it to his psychoanalyst to close the door. He said this was a kind of ballet that they did. And he didn't remark on it, or they didn't make it part of the discourse of the psychoanalysis for quite a long time. But then, after this man had become more comfortable with his own free associations and with the relationship in the analytic setting, they began to explore what this could mean, how it meant many, many things, how leaving the door open gave him a way out. It allowed people to overhear the conversation. It allowed the analyst to play an active role in beginning the session, and so on. Lots of other fantasies of a more erotic kind also contributed, but that's one small example of how Freud opened an avenue for understanding how so many of our actions and the symbolic actions of dreaming are replete with meanings that can be explored and discovered by forming a special kind of relationship to oneself and to other people. The analytic setting is just a special form of dialogue, and that this would enrich someone's understanding of themselves and the unconscious sources of their own individual life. So with that as a kind of cultural inheritance, you can see that virtually every character on the stage in realistic drama owes something to Freud. Modern understanding of how acting is done owes an enormous amount to Freud. Actors don't need to have been in psychoanalysis, although some, like Sidney Poirier, who once played a psychiatrist, were for a long time in psychoanalysis and speak about how that contributed to their understanding of themselves as actors as well as people. It doesn't have to have a direct relationship. It suffuses the understanding of character as multi-layered, as not always in possession consciously. Because one of the things that Freud discovered is that the women, and not all women, but mostly women, who suffered from hysterical symptoms, bodily symptoms, were engaged in a form of unspoken social protest. That in fact the body was acting out what they could not admit to language or find language for. And that this is happening in our everyday lives all the time. As Freud once said, it oozes out of us at every pore. We can't really hide very successfully, but we're always trying to hide. And psychoanalysis is about transforming those forms of action into language. Well, what actor today doesn't, at least in part, view the task of acting as doing just that, transforming the body into words? That's the central process in psychoanalysis. So what Freud did was not just discover things about human mind, or psyche, soma, body and mind. He invented a method for exploring these things. Character that he was actually encountering in his practice. Someone like Lady Macbeth, who's destroyed by success. He said, well, this actually happens. People live their lives so that they turn every success into a failure. And here is a model for that behavior. So Freud could see in Shakespeare a kind of precursor and origin of his own interests And I think so can we. He does genuinely owe a great deal to Shakespearean drama, as well as other literature, as he acknowledged. So psychoanalysis overlaps with literature and other arts right from the beginning, even though Freud himself was only interested in some of them. Freud was very interested in archaeology, of course. He was interested in art. He was interested in ancient things, in the person and in the culture and in history. But he was not very interested in arts that came to owe a great deal to him and psychoanalysis. For example, he didn't go to movies. He had virtually no interest at all in music, which until recently has not been very much explored by psychoanalysts. Wasn't very interested in photography. In many ways, he stayed in the 19th century. But he opened up the avenues for these arts in the 20th century that were quite revolutionary. This is a kind of paradox. Freud is a conservative revolutionary, someone who in many ways was not very interested in what he unleashed and the ways in which he informed so many different aspects of the arts that came after him. I think maybe the one artist who transcends the division between the conservative and the revolutionary Freud is himself a conservative revolutionary, and that's Shakespeare. Because Shakespeare is in many ways a very conservative thinker, but had this enormous diagnostic power so that he could show the implications of whatever he took up. And Freud is a lot like that. He doesn't openly encourage revolutionary thinking, certainly not in a political sense. He was not interested in that at all. There's almost nothing about contemporary politics in Freud. But his ideas become revolutionary in political as well as in cultural and aesthetic realms in the course of the 20th century. For example, Freud had a great influence on the surrealists, and he did meet Salvador Dali, but he didn't think they really got what he was saying. He didn't think surrealism was psychoanalysis. On the other hand, he could analyze a poet like H.D. In the turmoil of the 1930s and recognize that her art was something that she depended on as a stay against madness and also as a way of creatively transforming aspects of herself that might not have survived otherwise. He was very liberating for her. And she wrote about this in a book called Tribute to Freud, in a way that acknowledges how liberating he was. In fact, part of his paradoxical conservative revolutionary personality has to do with the fact that he set forth guidelines and rules for analysis, and he regularly broke them himself. Freud was not very Freudian in his practice. He would give lectures to his patients. He would sometimes even ask his wife to make a sandwich. He wasn't a strict Freudian. This happened later, mostly in America. I think in relation to films, for example, there might be at least two ways of looking at this. One, we might look at a filmmaker who is directly influenced by Freud and acknowledges it, and whose film is a self-exploration. I'm thinking of Bertolucci. I'm thinking of, say, Last Tango in Paris, which is a film about a very disturbed man who acts out and attempts, I think, to cure unsuccessfully a profoundly traumatic loss. And Bertolucci was well aware of this and well aware of how it had deep roots in his own personal experience and how he was making a Freudian film in the sense that his film would display in symbolic form the kinds of dreams that he had about this. It's a very dreamlike film. It's got a kind of mythic level that has to do with, I think, the Orphic myth of going back to the underworld and returning. But it also feels very much like a dream. And it's very self-conscious. There's a filmmaker in the film. And all of this, Bertolucci acknowledges, owes a lot to Freud and psychoanalysis. So in that case, you can see a direct relationship. But that might not always be the case. To take another enormously popular film, if we were to look at The Godfather, I doubt that Mario Puzo was reading Freud or had any interest directly in psychoanalysis. But without Freud and without psychoanalysis, the family relationships that are so central and powerful in that whole sequence of films would be inconceivable. They're about godfathers and godsons and how they relate to women and how the family is the center of meaning in people's lives and how it relates to the larger society. All of these things are Freudian themes. They're at the center of a psychoanalytic view of what individuals and cultures are about. And you can find those sorts of attitudes around the world now. Because some of these dynamics that have their origin in the family are universal. Rivalry between brothers wasn't invented by Freud or Shakespeare, but it's pervasive in cultures, actual and symbolic brothers. Twins and doubles are not Freud's invention, but they're pervasive as aspects of identity formation and conflict and so on. Freud gave us a way to understand how meaningful these things are and how deeply rooted they are in human development. I think even though some schools, say Lacanians, don't like to focus on the developmental aspect of things, I think it's central. And that what Freud contributed was a way, a method for exploring things that have the deepest roots in our earliest experience. Very tenacious roots. Roots that are prior to language, prior to even the ability to form symbols, but are very, very formative in the way we actually live and act in our lives. Today we would call that a procedural memory. We learn processes and rhythms and forms of interaction before we say a word. And psychoanalysis leads us back to those things. And today, the focus would be, as I said, on the tenacity and formative power, positive and negative, of those earliest experiences.
What was the name of the series with Gandolfini?
Oh, The Sopranos, yes. Well, that's
related to that.
There's another dimension of psychoanalytic influence is the proliferation of therapists in the media, quasi-Freudian therapists, like the woman who treats Gandolfini in The Sopranos. She's not bad, actually, although when people interview her, she doesn't show much interest in psychoanalysis. She's a good actress, and she knows how to play a therapist. But those sorts of therapists, turn up on television, they turn up in films, in serious and in sometimes in very comic forms. They would be inconceivable without Freud. They're usually, in American media anyway, confused with psychiatrists. I have to explain to my students that psychiatrists and psychoanalysts are not necessarily the same. Although many psychoanalysts are also psychiatrists, it's a very American phenomenon to link so closely the medical and the therapeutic professions. It's not the case in other countries. And Freud did not want it to be that way. But in America, after the Second World War, with the emigration of so many European analysts who needed legitimacy and a way to continue their practices, psychoanalysis became deeply embedded in the medical world, where it remained until quite recently. Until it was actually, ironically, challenged by the psychologists who wanted access to psychoanalytic training without medical credentials. And that opened up psychoanalysis in a way that the analysts themselves. Freud's fundamental contribution was to make creative activity, the formation of the arts, continuous with the basic elements of the mind in general. That is to say, dreaming is at the basis of all the arts. It's also the most common phenomenon in human life. We may be dreaming all the time. We're certainly dreaming a lot when we sleep. Freud didn't understand a lot of the relations between sleep and dreaming. He thought dreams existed to preserve sleep. The opposite may actually be more true today, that sleeping exists to allow us to dream. In any case, what Freud saw is that the dream is continuous with the play of childhood, the expression of writers, with all the arts. That is to say, in a sense, he made us all into artists, but only artists can make the material of art into actual works of art. But he made the activity of dreaming central to all of the aesthetic dimensions of human life. I think that's a central contribution, and I think that's new. So that the notion of the artist as a lone and singular genius, the 19th century notion that got attached to Shakespeare and other artists, is fundamentally undermined by a Freudian view. The notion that everyone is potentially creative, that there's a continuity between the way my mind works and great artists' minds work, is a contribution of psychoanalysis. And it's a permanent change in the way we view ourselves. So that today, we seek to find those dimensions of ourselves in all kinds of ways that are involved with the arts, but even go beyond the arts. We see an aesthetic dimension to politics. We see an aesthetic dimension to every form of symbolic expression. The way people use Facebook, the way they make the narrative in political campaigns. All of these things assume a kind of common mental activity that ultimately has its origins in the processes of a symbolic representation that are dreaming in its purest form. So it's not to use the phrase lightly when we say he made everyone into a kind of artist, because everyone dreams. And without Freud, we wouldn't look at the world that way. That seems to me to be absolutely fundamental. When I'm teaching psychoanalysis to students from different disciplines, I start with the interpretation of dreams. And that's where I started myself when I was in high school. I came across this short version of the book called On Dreams that Freud wrote later on. And that got me started with the study of psychoanalysis and the teaching in different settings of psychoanalytic ideas. Psychoanalysis, you can't imagine Lenny Bruce in American culture without psychoanalysis. He confronted the American society at the time with all of its repressed desires. In our face, all of our sexual fantasies, all of our suppressed desires to express fantasies and to even to insult people. He was very, very good at that. He's a very Freudian comic. I don't think any stand-up comedy is without Freud, and many of them are directly related. But Freud was very interested in humor because, and one of the books that's underappreciated in the earlier Freud, or in 1905, is his book on jokes, because he saw that jokes were simultaneously exemplary of mental processes, but also forms of social protest. A joke is a form of aggression. Someone is the victim of the joke. And there always is a kind of social setting, if not in the characters in the joke, at least in the mind of the comedian. And so joking was something naturally that very much interested Freud. His book is full of examples, mostly from his own culture, which being Jewish in Vienna, suffered from the suppression of its expressions in more direct ways during Freud's lifetime. So humor and comedy certainly owe an enormous amount to Freud. And Freud would acknowledge that they owed Freud. In fact, one of the things I did before coming here was to Google Freud and various other subjects. Freud in painting, Freud in literature, Freud in art, Freud in jokes. Freud is everywhere. Wherever you link Freud with something else, you find a very rich inheritance available in an instant today. So it's very hard to separate Freud from this pervasive climate of opinion, as Auden said. And it's impossible, not only is it impossible to deny, but it's impossible to evade. No matter how many times Freud bashers try to dismiss Freud, he will still be there.